KEET-TV's Blueprint Humboldt is a four-part series addressing local sustainability issues involving alternative energy sources, food production, business strategies, and community development. Tonight on Blueprint Humboldt, moderator Julie Fulkerson leads a panel discussion on RESCO, the Renewable Energy Secure Community Plan. Matthew Marshall of the Redwood Coast Energy Authority, David Rubin of Pacific Gas and Electric, and Jim Zoellick of the Schatz Energy Research Center will participate in the discussion. Coming up next on Blueprint Humboldt. Humboldt County is positioned to achieve high levels of renewable energy development, meeting a large fraction of our energy needs. The county has a relatively small electrical demand and a wealth of local energy resources such as wood waste for biomass fuel. Biomass-fired generators already provide a third of the local demand. In addition, there are large wind and wave resources that can be developed. Shell Wind Energy has already proposed development of a 50-megawatt wind power project on Bear River Ridge. In addition, PG&E has recently repowered their natural gas-fired power plant at King Salmon with high-efficiency engine generators that are well-suited to follow changes in the intermittent supply of renewable electricity. The Renewable Energy Secure Community, or RESCO, study is a collaboration between the Redwood Coast Energy Authority, the Schatz Energy Research Center at Humboldt State University, and the Pacific Gas and Electric Company to develop a strategic plan for local renewable energy development. The goal of the strategic plan is to develop local renewable energy resources to meet 75% or more of the local electricity demand and a significant fraction of heating and transportation energy needs by the year 2030.
Good evening. Thank you for joining us. We live in a world where we're desperately seeking good news. Tonight we will hear some of that. I'm happy to be facilitating a panel of local leaders who are steeped in challenges and solutions around the theme of sustainable energy. So let me introduce our panel. Matthew Marshall is the Executive Director of the Redwood Coast Energy Authority. And I just have to say, Matthew just recently returned from his energy job in Denver. He was originally from Humboldt and a graduate of Humboldt State, so we have a renewable resource back with us. Welcome back. Thanks. And Jim Zoellick, who is the Senior Research Engineer, also a Humboldt State graduate and a local resource, with the Schatz Energy Research Center. And David Rubin, PG&E Director of Service Analysis. Thank you all for being here.
Thank you. Thanks, Julie.
Let's start, Jim, with you, talking a little bit about RESCO, or the Renewable Energy Secure Community, sort of the essence of the project, how you three are partners, and where you are in the time frame.
Sure. Thank you, Julie. RESCO is a strategic planning study for the development of renewable energy resources in Humboldt County. The focus is on aiming to develop a large portion of our local renewable resources to meet our local energy needs. And it's a project that's funded by the California Energy Commission. It's a 2-year project that we're 1 year into at this point. And the project partners are the Redwood Coast Energy Authority, along with Matthew and his crew, the Schatz Energy Research Center at Humboldt State, and then Pacific Gas and Electric Company. And David is our key liaison at PG&E.
Would you like to add a little more, any of you, about what the sort of the goals and the process that you're engaged in? What are some specific things that you're looking at this moment with the RESCO project?
Well, the big picture goal is to, as was stated, to get a significant chunk of our energy, 75 or up to 100% from renewable resources that are available locally in Humboldt County, which is a very aggressive goal. Yes. I mean, it's something that has not been done very many places in the world, frankly, and so it's definitely going to be a challenge. But I think we've got some good partners and the resources to begin that planning phase to really start looking at detailed analysis of how can we really make that possible. What are where the rubber meets the road, and the devil's in the details on a lot of these things, where you can say, oh, it's possible, but how do you really work out those details?
That 75, did you say 75 to 100% sustainable? Isn't that an exciting goal?
It's a very exciting goal, and I think, as Matthew said, it's the study is to develop a long-range plan and that's kind of where the aggressive goal comes in. But there's also, the aim will be to develop, identify near-term next steps that can move us toward that goal. Mm-hmm. We realize this is not going to happen overnight, and whether we're able to achieve 75 or 100% or somewhere in that range, that's not that critical. But what's important, I think, is to identify, where we want to get to, and then really focus on the near-term next steps and start taking those incremental steps. Mm-hmm. And certainly, David's involvement at PG&E. They're the experts in developing and providing energy resources, and really getting their input as to what's realistic, so that we're not just dreaming about a utopian future, but we're actually identifying things that we can do and that we can realize in the next, say, 5 to 10 years, moving toward a long-term 20, 30-year plan.
Okay. David, let's look at what is reasonable. Is this 75 to 100% sustainable energy just a wild idea, or is that the real possibility? You have the bigger picture because you're working with PG&E, and these are sort of statewide, national issues. So what do you think?
We're intrigued by the prospects. This is a very resource-rich area, and when you take a look at the electric load in Humboldt County, it is modest by comparison to other parts of California, other parts of our service territory. So certainly, in some sense, if it's going to happen anywhere, I think Humboldt is probably one of the best suited areas, just because it is well endowed with respect to various types of renewable resources. And again, the load characteristics are such that we may well be able to get well beyond where we're going in the rest of the state, which I think you're aware of is now 33% of our power mix by 2020 will be comprised of renewable resources. So 75 to 100% obviously is well beyond the sort of statewide standard. Mm-hmm. And again, this area will be one of the leaders.
Can you say a little more about the ways that goal might be met, say through the wind, wave, biomass, other energy sources, solar?
The resources that seem to have the best prospects at this point, and Jim, you can correct me or add to this, Matthew as well, seem to be biomass and wind in this particular area, at least sort of in the near to midterm, just because of the availability of the resource. One of the challenges here as well as elsewhere is not just simply identifying the source of wind power or biomass, but it's actually getting the power production facilities permitted, sited, financed. Mm-hmm. And that's a struggle that we're experiencing throughout the state, frankly, and for that matter, throughout the country.
So maybe we want to talk a little bit about this, because on one hand, it's great to have some good ideas in this startup process, but then there's the reality of how do you actually make them happen? And I think a lot of people are looking for action and possibilities. So do you want to add to that, Jim?
Yeah, I think that's, in terms of the strategic plan and in terms of identifying the near-term next steps, that's really the focus. We want to bring this down to actually, making getting some results on the ground. Just say one thing about the aggressive goal. David's saying that the goal statewide is 33% by 2020, and so 75% is over twice that. But Humboldt County right now, and for quite some time, we already have a large amount of biomass electricity produced locally, on the order of a third already. So if you take that into account, in terms of Humboldt County, we're already a substantial way toward that goal of 75%, and that was why the goal was sort of set so high. Is looking at where we are currently, that that's not, it doesn't make it quite as so unrealistic, I think. That's not to say there won't be dramatic challenges to try to achieve that.
So you're saying biomass is already achieving the 1/3 level?
If you just look at Humboldt County, but that's not, Humboldt County, we basically anything that's produced here, the biomass power plants, most of them, or two of them, sell the power to PG&E. Mm-hmm. The third one, Blue Lake Power, that just started up recently, is selling actually to San Diego Gas and Electric. So, in terms of the accounting of who gets to take credit for it, that's kind of a different issue. But in terms of, if you just look at the boundaries of Humboldt County and how much we consume here and what's produced, then yes. So
can one of you address, because I think there are a lot of people who aren't even as familiar with what is happening with biomass in the county. So let's hear a little more about exactly what biomass is and how it could be producing 1/3 of the energy needs. Is that something you want to address, Jim?
Sure. Biomass is based on the fact that we're a timber producing region, and even though that's been in decline, there's basically has been historically and still is a lot of waste material from the timber products industry, both from the mills, but also that's stuff from the forest, sort of forest slash and so forth. And so at one time that was burned in teepee burners and created a terrible air quality problem here. They moved then to producing basically burning that in a boiler, producing steam and producing electricity. So they cleaned up the air problem to a large degree and made use of a resource. And that's kind of where we're at now. In terms of moving forward and increasing that supply from biomass, one of the things that people are looking at is utilizing material in the forest that where currently the Forest Service and others want to reduce the fire hazard. There's too much fuel built up and it's a fire hazard problem. So if they remove that, and already they do some of that and often just burn it in place, if that could be collected, there again as a resource, the issue is, when is it economical? Some of it is in remote places and getting it to a power plant. There are some challenges with that, and certainly, sustainable forest practices need to be taken into account and so forth.
So biomass is a great example of taking a waste product, a real problem, and turning it into a part of the solution and creating energy. It's a really great model.
Right.
And I'm wondering, Matthew, are there other examples that you might point to? I know that your organization, the Redwood Coast Energy Authority, has been working on some other ideas. Do you want to describe a couple of those?
Well, one of the big things is efficiency has to kind of always be first, and people don't necessarily think of that as a generation option, but it's really the first step because it's a low or sometimes cash positive way to provide energy by just not using it in the first place, and so really that always comes first. It's something that is a good step that you can take now while other projects are developing, and then beyond that, there's the opportunity to look at wind projects in the area, and then there was the WAVE pilot project that PG&E had going. That's been delayed a little bit because it was originally envisioned the pilot wasn't really feasible as it was designed, which is why you do pilots, to figure out what are the issues with things like permitting and financing and working out all those kinks to make a new technology, in this case, viable. And so, that's the goal of the study, is to really evaluate those options and kind of see which ones make the most sense for the community, for the environment, and economically, and that are viable to meet the electricity demand in the community, which is not a consistent sort of load. You've got peaks during the day, and then it goes down at night, and those loads don't necessarily match up with the demand or the production from renewable energy. And so biomass is an example that's it's pretty consistent and it's stable, but wind or wave might be mostly at night when people aren't using electricity. And so how do you kind of adjust to those variations? And one of the things that's actually been very helpful is PG&E's new power plant in Eureka, that they've actually designed that to be very adaptable. And so it's got, rather than one big generator that has to be run kind of all the time to be efficient, it's got all these smaller units that they can turn on and off rapidly. And so that really allows the community to build the kind of renewable energy we want, and then that can kind of fill in the gaps on short notice when, there's a little fluctuation and we need a little bit more power, but the renewables aren't supplying it. It's really an adaptable technology. So that's been a great thing that they've done that to kind of pave the way for these renewable projects that hopefully will come online in the future.
So it's interesting, just in a few sentences, you've gone from, really, we could do this conversation in the dark. That would be one way to save energy, and just listen to our voices, which might work. But it is something you can do at home when you don't need your lights on. So that's sort of, you're working at the very grassroots, individual, family level, but also addressing the broader levels, which of course then we go to PG&E and to David, and I think you might want to add some other ideas about this.
Yeah, I was first of all just going to amplify the point about energy efficiency. Us practitioners in the field call it the Hippocratic Oath. First, do no harm. So the first thing you do is you look for opportunities to reduce energy consumption, which all of our customers can do, have been doing, and can continue to do. And in some sense, and again, we've been talking about electricity, but a lot of the issues around production of carbon dioxide, which is obviously the most important consideration around addressing global warming, are in sectors outside electricity consumption. They're primarily in transport, as well as fuel-based, say, heating for homes. And one of the elements of the program and the study is to look for ways in which there can be synergies. Once we work with customers to reduce their consumption, look for new technologies, electric vehicles, for example, that would actually then plug in and take advantage of our clean energy supply. And by doing so, again, reducing carbon emissions in the transport sector, or using technologies like heat pumps that are electric driven to provide heat to homes, as opposed to somebody, again, burning gas or propane in a heater or a boiler. And so there are great opportunities beyond just simply looking at where can we tap the nearest or put in a new wind farm that'll be focused on how energy is consumed in the homes.
So when you talk about the sort of the small incremental choices that we can each make, they don't require environmental impact reports, there's no real process to go through, we can just each take responsibility. In fact, we can eat more vegetables and less meat and really cut the consumption. So, but when we go to the other levels of biomass and wave energy and so forth, let's talk a little bit about technical constraints and economic and environmental opportunities, both sides of that equation, that are associated with sustainable energy options. What are a little bit about the constraints and those challenges which you experienced with the wave energy project, but others I'm sure. So,
right. Well, I think, you know, a big constraint, sort of a given, I think, maybe people don't think about this much, but the supply, the energy that's being generated, the supply has to meet the demand. If the supply doesn't meet the demand, the lights go out, and you know that happens infrequently in the United States. I mean, we have a very reliable electricity system. PG&E does a very good job of providing us with that service. So, as Matthew mentioned, you know, wind power, the wind blows. When it blows hard, you get a lot of energy. When it dies down, you don't, and we can't control that. Same thing with the waves. Same thing with solar. Biomass we can sort of turn it on and off as we want to. So that's an important constraint, is the supply has to meet the demand. And as we introduce more renewable resources and these intermittent resources, that becomes a more complicated task. And as both David and Matthew were talking about, the new PG&E power plant is very well suited to be able to adapt quickly. So that's an important piece. The thing that David said also, I think, about electric vehicles and heat pumps, Humboldt County is pretty isolated with respect to we're sort of like an energy island, or maybe a peninsula is maybe more appropriate, but we're connected to the larger electric grid that serves California and even the nation by, you know, fairly small connections. And in fact, we're not even able to bring all the electricity we need into the county through that connection. We have to generate power here. That's part of the reason why PG&E's plant is here and why the biomass plants are here. So if we develop renewable resources to a large degree, which we can, at some point we're going to have excess at times that we either need to send out of the county, but there's going to be limits to that. The other option is to essentially start to develop other electric loads, if there are electric resources like, say, wind and wave, other electric loads, which could be vehicles. And as David said, that's a huge, there's huge benefits there in terms of carbon emissions and also in terms of cost. You know, gasoline is not a cheap fuel. So if we have excess renewables that we develop locally and we're able to start to use those to charge electric vehicles or run heat pumps, you know, that's a way to sort of make some headway into those other energy sectors and also deal with the limitations of the infrastructure and our connection to the outside world. So.
Great. You know, I realize you're in the middle of a 2-year study, and most of us don't want to hear about a study sitting on the shelf. So I guess my next question really is, what do you see as the long-term vision and how the next steps will fit that so that we can feel confident that RESCO is going to actually have some positive results in the end?
Right. Matthew, do you want to say a little something about sort of the next step for that?
How can this become a reality,
well, because
basically?
that's, I mean, you know, we're not interested in writing a report for the sake
sure
of,
not.
you know, doing a bunch of work and, you know, having it set on a shelf.
Yeah.
And so that's where, you know, it really comes down to doing, you know, serious detailed analysis of, you know, what really can work and what can't work, you know, what makes sense, like I said, for the community. And then the economics is the piece of it that, you know, sometimes it's interesting to get into the technology, but the technology is pretty viable, it's pretty understood, you know, the resources are understood, you know, where the challenge can be is really engaging the community and figuring out the financing and, you know, working with partners on that side of it and with PG&E and figuring out how can we make this actually economically work so that it actually happens. And that's the real challenge, probably much more than the technological challenges which have been solved for the most part.
So you mentioned that key word, engaging the community. And I'm assuming, David, you've had a lot of experiences about engaging the community and what that means. Is that a challenge? It certainly was with some of the projects we've mentioned. How do you work with the community?
It is a very significant challenge, and I don't know that there's any magic formula other than making sure that you communicate extensively and broadly, and that hopefully will be at least an entree into getting particular projects permitted and cited in particular areas. And to give you just some examples, most of the power, and particularly the renewable power that's on our grid, is supplied by third parties that are themselves responsible for developing and financing the project. So while PG&E is not as directly involved in the process of siting new renewable power plants, we work with partners that are. And I can tell you, the part of the process around signing a contract for power is probably the simplest part. And we've been doing a lot of that, and we have a lot of renewable power supplies under contract. But what becomes really the most challenging part is actually having those projects get the appropriate permits from either the local agencies, depending on the type of project, or state, or in some cases, federal organizations. And then in these days now where, again, we're still working our way out of the financial crisis, attracting finance into these projects has been difficult. And so there are just a lot of moving parts, but in terms of engaging the community and having the community be involved, it's critically important. Again, we have very aggressive goals. California has the most aggressive renewable goals in the country. And again, that's to get to 33% by 2020. If we're talking about 75% here, even if we're starting at a base of 33, it's still going to require a lot of detailed work with all members of the community to make sure that they understand that the types of facilities that we'll be building, be it wind turbines, solar farms in some cases, biomass projects, are an important part of helping us all achieve the sustainability objectives that we have. Because there's a tendency to say, yes, we want more renewables, but then when you try to site the plant, the obvious NIMBYism that we're all familiar with sets in.
Mm-hmm. That's why it's interesting to think of it in terms of what we can individually do as a starting place. I think of Humboldt County as a place where there are people who see a problem and jump in to provide solutions, and that's what this partnership is doing. And so now the question is, how do we get all the rest of us to understand what you're up to so that we're not resistant when you come up with the list of possibilities? So do you still see that pioneering spirit alive and well here?
Well, I think it is, but there's a challenge to it that, as the NIMBYism issue, we want to be in control of our destiny, and I think there's a lot of excitement about doing projects in our community, but we also have to remember that the energy issues that the world are facing are global issues, and so the no action alternative really isn't acceptable. Mm-hmm. And so we can't say, well, gosh, I'd rather not have, I love wind farms, but I won't want one, in my neighborhood, so to speak. Mm-hmm. And it's like, well, we have to contribute our part, and potentially we can be really an example for the world. And so, you kind of have to look beyond our borders and not just say, well, what are the impacts of this project locally, but what are the impacts to the world if we don't do this project, and and how are we a part of that larger picture, and not just thinking about ourselves, even though obviously our love of the community is going to be a major factor in what we want to accomplish.
Is it too early to hazard a guess as to which of these projects are going to be more viable, or do we need to wait for a year and hear the final report?
I think it is too early. I mean, David mentioned, I think we have a tremendous wind resource. Wave is something, we have a tremendous resource, but it's a very immature technology. Biomass is something that's already proven. I think in terms of what people can do, we talked about energy efficiency. That's a huge piece of the puzzle. People can make choices to put solar panels on their roof. That's another piece of the puzzle. People can choose to buy an electric vehicle, which will be coming available, in the next year. And people can choose to try to educate themselves, and that's really part of our job, I think, as part of this study. It's doing the research, but then it's sharing that information with the community. And I think one of the things people need to realize, and people know this, but it's sometimes, especially when it's in my backyard, it becomes a bigger issue, is that none of these alternatives have zero impact. Wind turbines kill birds in some situations. Solar panels take up areas where wildlife could be. Wave farm has an issue with fisheries, whatever. But as Matthew said, the no action alternative, in my mind, is really not an alternative. There's impacts there that are causing serious damage, on a global scale. And so we need to sort of look at all of that and say, you know what, this is important environmentally, and it's also important economically for our community, I think, to develop some of these local resources, which will create local jobs, local economic stimulus. So in terms of sustainability, it's not just environmental sustainability, but also economic sustainability. And I think if we look at that whole picture and the trade-offs, in my mind, the answer is starting to develop more of these local resources. Yes, there's going to be some impact, but and it needs to be done responsibly. But I think that ultimately, in the big picture, that's there'll be more benefit than cost to us as a community to do that.
So it's clear that we obviously need to understand that the no alternative is not the alternative. So we need to be better educated. So I really appreciate that the three of you are working together and taking this leadership on. As we close, let me just ask one more question, just if you can briefly say, what is the one thing where the North Coast seems to be headed that you're most excited about? And that's a pretty big question, so we'll give it a moment to pause. But then when you think of sort of your headline answer to that question, what is the one thing that you're most excited about in this arena? Matthew?
I would say, especially coming back to Humboldt County after being away for
Yes.
a while, that the amount of excitement and the amount of commitment in the community towards a sustainable energy future is pretty exciting to see. I mean, for an area our size, there's a lot of resources and a lot of energy and a lot of expertise going to this, and a lot of community participation in the work that the Energy Authority does with PG&E on the efficiency side. I was looking at the numbers, and it's hundreds of thousands of dollars a year in savings to local businesses and local residents in energy efficiency, and that resulted from hundreds of thousands of dollars of investment and job creation, because all that work is, you can't export those jobs. They're not outsourceable. It's work that happens here, and so that savings is great.
Great example.
Yeah.
Do you want to add?
And I was actually going to add on top of that, again, you had mentioned we can have this program in the dark and save energy, and I just want to underscore the fact that energy efficiency really means using energy smarter as opposed to having to sacrifice. And so many of the things that our customers are doing and can be doing really involve just simply using energy smarter. And what I see in Humboldt, again, is that real pioneering, can-do type of spirit that I think will really take things forward.
So we're saving money, and you get 10 words to close this up.
Well, I would just say, the RESCO project itself is a pioneering effort. Communities historically have not been really involved in energy planning on a local level, so I think that's a really exciting thing.
Thank you, all three of you, very much. Join us again for the next Blueprint discussion. And we want to thank KEET, and also say that KEET.org will have more information for you online. I want to thank Matthew Marshall, David Rubin, and Jim Zoellick.